civic engagement, telemedicine, all kinds of new medical products to monitor our health, detect diseases before they actually become serious. We talked about smart grid and public safety. This chart is really just about forecasting, as a result of those devices, the increases that we can see in traffic ramping up in the coming years. So I don't recall what the figure is, but it's somewhere around about a third of all the devices today are smartphones. So as those proliferate, the consumption and the impact on the networks is only going to grow. We identified a number of policy changes that are needed. First is that there's a lack of transparency in the allocation and utilization of spectrum. Most of the licensing information is on the Universal Licensing System, ULS. How many of you have ever used ULS? A handful of you. So one of the things we're trying to do is make sure you don't need a PhD to use ULS. It's a very complicated system right now. So what we did is we had put out something called the Spectrum Dashboard. It's a beta version of a way to get into a database that tells you what spectrum is being used where. There are really a few spectrum reallocation tools. The basic ones are we can take from one service and give it to another. That's a painful process. It takes years. We can share spectrum. If you're an incumbent, it's pretty rare for anybody, any incumbent, to want to share their space. So we're looking at ways we can do things like opportunistic use of the spectrum, economic models, incentive auctions, and so forth to make that process be more dynamic. There's insufficient capacity for broadband, and the spectrum can take years to reclaim. There's suboptimal backhaul deployment. So we put all these cell sites out, and you have to have a way to get them into the network. And so the consumption there is growing as well. And the opportunities, whether they're wireless or access to dark fiber, et cetera, are not always there. The access models are limited. Only recently did we start using techniques like dynamic spectrum access. And lastly, the policy scope is too bounded. There's no framework for identifying future spectrum bands and needs. And the coordination across multiple domestic and international stakeholders really has not been as effective as it might be. So the things that we're doing, I already mentioned, ensuring greater transparency in allocation and utilization. Spectrum Dashboard's first step. Also, there is pending legislation in Congress for the FCC and NTIA to conduct a spectrum inventory. There's versions of that bill that have passed both the House and the Senate. Usually a pretty good indicator that a bill is ultimately going to be passed out of the Congress. And it will guide the Commission as to the specific things that the Congress wants the agencies to do. Secondly, to expand the incentives and mechanisms available to reallocate or repurpose spectrum, we've asked Congress, or recommended to Congress, that it adopt legislation to create incentive auctions and to also adopt spectrum fees. So what's an incentive auction? Incentive auction is where you have a license and business has been so-so. And you're thinking maybe you want to get out of the business, but you still want to be able to make your money back. You may opt in to an auction and set a baseline at which you wouldn't sell below the baseline, but if the auction went higher, you would. And it's a way for incumbents who have spectrum that may be willing to transfer it to somebody else to participate in an auction that could repurpose that spectrum. Thirdly, to make more spectrum available. We said that within 10 years, we'd make 500 megahertz of spectrum available, 300 megahertz of that within the next 5 years. I'll walk through some of the proceedings in a minute. We'll facilitate deployment of spectrum for wireless backhaul with more flexible rules. We'll expand the opportunities for dynamic and innovative spectrum access models. Talked about identifying a block of spectrum for unlicensed to provide additional ways to have opportunistic access to spectrum. And we talked about trying to support research and development in advanced spectrum access technologies. And to also increase the comprehensiveness of our spectrum policy for the FCC to work with the NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration, which oversees the federal use of the spectrum. So this is a list of some of the proceedings that we're planning. The first is to make spectrum for the wireless communication service viable for mobile. The debate on this issue has been about potential interference to satellite radio. Satellite radio, the WCS spectrum sits on both sides of the satellite radio band, so they're concerned about interference from mobile devices into receivers. We've got we laid out a schedule for dealing with all of these, and we plan to address this in the second quarter. Second was something we called Advanced Wireless Service, or AWS 2 and 3. We're working with the NTIA to see whether we can gain access to some of the federal spectrum that could be paired with the AWS 3 band and make a decision on what direction to go by October 1st. The D block, this is the block of 700 megahertz spectrum that sits adjacent to spectrum that's been allocated for public safety. In the plan, we discuss that we should move ahead with the auction of that spectrum. For the mobile satellite services, to provide flexibility in the rules to better permit the introduction of terrestrial service in those bands. And probably the issue that's getting the most discussion is reallocation of 120 megahertz from the broadcast TV bands. This is part of the proposal for providing for incentive auctions. And we've made it very clear, I know the chairman has reiterated this, that participation in this would be voluntary by the broadcasters. I'm not going to go through all of the details on this. TV white spaces was one of the things we talked about. As most of you know, we conducted a very contentious proceeding on providing access to the TV white spaces for unlicensed devices. We have 17 petitions for reconsideration to deal with. We also have got applications from 9 organizations that want to be a TV white space database manager. We're hoping to address those issues, we said, in the third quarter. So that's not too far away either. Contiguous spectrum for unlicensed, which I mentioned, where we're starting right now is just talking to some of the stakeholders in the industry. What bands might make sense? How big? The amount of spectrum that you would need for this to be viable. So we're hoping by the end of the year that we'll be able to identify some ideas for where that might come from. Opportunistic spectrum use, we're planning a notice of proposed rulemaking in the third quarter. And we're also planning to do a notice of proposed rulemaking to find ways we can improve the experimental licensing program. The only other thing on this slide that I'm going to touch on is a strategic spectrum plan and a triennial assessment. We viewed the plan as the first step in laying out where do we want to go on spectrum. It's going to be, and we also established a spectrum task force that was just announced on Monday. The objective of the task force is to implement the plan, but we also need to be thinking more long-term about some of these ideas for spectrum management. And so that's part of our plan as well. So what does all this mean for TCBs?